The gifts that you received were these diaries handcrafted for this conference by women in India who are working to empower themselves and become economically self-sufficient, to an organization called Kriti. And you can find out information about this at www.gestures.in. And the design is a fulkari design, which is a Punjabi folk embroidery. As we are launching and celebrating the Round Glass Center, which focuses on Punjab. So please, everyone, I do want to start. We are a little bit late, unlike what I wanted to do, but time is money, and literally time is money when you have a panel of lawyers. So I used to be a corporate lawyer for 6 years, and I loved that I could fly to Latin America to do deals, lie flat and sleep, and still bill for the travel. So we have Indian lawyers here who are some of the top lawyers in the country and the world. We have a global head of the global Seattle-based law firm, Judge Ketu, who is a Indian, who's going to be the moderator. He's a King County judge and a pillar of the Indian American legal community. The last panel was about doing business in India and the United States. Now we're going to talk about, well, how do you actually effectuate that through the legal regimes? What are the legal regimes, right? You need lawyers, as one of the panelists, Avik said, make sure you're complying with norms, make sure you're complying with federal norms, and these are the experts that we've brought together to help talk about that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Judge Ketu.
Thank you, Sheetal, and thank you to the Seattle University for hosting us. And don't worry, the lawyers here will only bill in 6-minute increments. Thank you for coming to our panel presentation here today. We heard kind of a business perspective earlier this morning. We're going to try to broaden that conversation to a more of a legal perspective. We have kind of a mix of lawyers and folks who are involved in business enterprises. And I think one of the things that we talked about in the morning presentation was about how we can be more inclusive and diversify our collaborations with India and Seattle. And one of the things that this panel and many of us as lawyers that are South Asian have learned in the last 20 to 25 years in Seattle is this legal field has changed dramatically, and the number of South Asian lawyers has increased dramatically. Pallavi here and I started a South Asian Bar Association some 25 years ago, and there was only like 6 or 7 lawyers around. And now there are hundreds of lawyers of South Asian descent that are here in King County. Some friends who are here practicing that have made this field very robust. And so we are going to talk about some of those issues and how India and Seattle can collaborate on the legal front. So our panel here is a stellar panel. As Sheetal mentioned, we have a couple folks from India and that are practicing, and then a couple folks here in the U.S. So our panel next to me is Pallavi Mehta Wahi, and next to her is Pratibha Jain, and next to her is Anurag Varma, and next to him is another Pallavi Shroff. We have been working on our panel here to try to talk about these different issues. And I want to give you a little background because I think it's important to understand where we come from. It shapes how we view the world. So Pallavi Wahi, to my right here, she's the co-United States and Seattle managing partner of K&L Gates, one of the biggest firms in the country. She is a chair of the firm-wide diversity committee. She represents clients in complex commercial litigation matters and works closely with Fortune 50 corporations. She's been recognized as a best lawyer in America in commercial litigation, and she's listed as one of the A-list international top Indian-focused lawyers, as compiled by the Indian Business Law Journal. She's also been named one of the 100 most influential lawyers by the U.S. editors of the Indian Business Law Journal, and she's also been listed as one of the Power 100 under the Puget Sound Business Journal most influential business leaders. In 2022, she was appointed to the branch board of directors at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and she is a chair of the Greater Seattle Chamber of Commerce. So please welcome Pallavi Wahi. Next to Pallavi, we have Pratibha Jain, who is General Counsel and Head of Strategy of the Everstone Group. Prior to her work at the Everstone Group, she was a partner with Nishit Desai Associates, where she founded their New Delhi office, and she led their funds and regulatory practice. She's an alumnus of Harvard Law School, Oxford University, and Delhi University. Previous to that, she's worked with Sullivan & Cromwell in New York, Tokyo, and Hong Kong, and Skadden Arp Slate, that's a firm, Meagher and Flom LLP in Hong Kong, and Goldman Sachs in Mumbai. She has represented the Ministry of Finance in setting up National Investment and Infrastructure Fund. She's represented investors for helping them list their companies in the stock exchange in India, including the BSE and IEX. She's also a member of the Aspen Global Leadership, and she won Women Lawyer of the Year Award in 2019 by the Business World magazine. She has been recognized as a top lawyer in the Forbes Legal Power list in 2020. Please welcome Prabhita. And next to Prabhita, we have, I'll catch up with my notes here. Anurag Varma. He's the Senior VP and Head of Public Affairs at Adani North America. In his role, he creates public policy strategies and stakeholder engagement for the entire Adani companies in the U.S. From 2016 to 2023, he held the same worldwide role for Infosys, and he was also a public policy counsel at Patent Boggs and Akin Gump firms representing foreign governments and other sovereign clients, Indian private sector interests, and India-American trade associations. He has also coordinated legal strategies for U.S. multinationals on market entry issues and other policy matters related to India. He has served on President Obama's Presidential Rank Awards Review Board, and he's been a pro bono counsel for the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Center. Anurag earned his degrees at Georgetown University Law, his LLM, his JD from University of Denver College of Law, and then his BCom from University of Alberta. And finally, we have, and please welcome Anurag for us. And finally, we have Pallavi Shroff next to Anurag. She is a managing partner at the and national practice head and dispute resolution for Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas and Company. She's a chief mentor for the competition law practice. She took over as a managing partner in 2015 and has grown the firm to become more than 100 partners with offices in 7 cities. She has over 39 years of extensive experience that spans across dispute resolution, competition law, and white-collar crime. She has been nominated by the government of India as a member of the Competition Law Review Committee and as a member of the high-level Raghavan Committee, which contemplated the new competition laws that were in 1999 and 2000. She has a wealth of experience in mentoring and advising young lawyers as well as clients. So please welcome Pallavi. So in preparation, we talked about some questions we'd like each of the panelists to discuss. And of course, as a judge, I want to keep the lawyers on their toes. And so I didn't send Pallavi Wahi the notes just to test her if she can think on her feet. So, Pallavi, how does a business or law firm work effectively with Indian law firms and foster good relationships to the benefits of their clients?
Thank you. Thanks for having us. First of all, just wanted to say thank you to Seetal and Eduardo. This is a fantastic event. Just looking around this room, I grew up in India. I've lived in Seattle for 25 years, and I've never been to a gathering like this. So like Ketu said, when we started the Seattle South Asian Bar Association, there were 6 of us. And none of us were partners. None of us were even successful, I think. But now where we sit, it's a different age and stage, and it's a great time for what Seattle University is doing. So thank you for your leadership on this. I think it's fantastic. So I think in response to your question, what I'm going to say is India, like most places in the world, is about relationships. And working with Indian law firms is also all about relationships. I feel like the critical things in India is to know the people and know the expertise. And I'm going to tell you a couple of stories because he gave me the outline an hour before, so that gave me enough time to write my stories. So when I was growing up, I grew up, and my neighbor was Pallavi Shroff's father, who was the Chief Justice of India, Chief Justice Bhagwati. So I was growing up, I was very ambitious, and I wanted to go to Cambridge Law School. And he knew me, and he wrote my letter of recommendation for Cambridge Law. And today I sit with her on this panel, and I get to work with her a lot. But it really is about this journey of relationships in India. So it's about getting to know people, getting to know them in authentic ways, and getting to know them in honest ways. Because India doesn't have a lot of lawyers per se in corporate firms, right? Just by comparison, K&L Gates is the world's 8th largest firm. We have 2,000 lawyers in 48 offices. And that includes about 200 of us who sit in Seattle, right? So you're looking at these mega firms that exist. And India has, I think Shardul Amarchand is one of the largest firms in India. So, I've known Pratibha as, I used to be her client, and now she's my client. So she gets revenge on me on a regular basis. But Pratibha and I know each other from having worked together when she was a partner at Nishit Desai. And now, of course, she's at Everstone Capital, and you'll hear all about that. But as you work in India, it's about honesty of relationships. So I think for me, when I'm working with clients who are either working with Indian law firms in India or conversely working with Indian law firms as partners for clients in the US, what we see a lot of is a lot of honesty in knowing the expertise. The Indian law firms are excellent. They have excellent lawyers. And it is sometimes frustrating to me when I hear from clients, making sure that the Indian lawyers are good enough, right? And I always say, yeah, I grew up there, so if I'm good enough, right? But knowing the expertise and being aware of the specialties is really important. I think respecting the intellect of where people come from and really respecting what they bring to the table is very important. I also think it's really important for businesses to understand it is a different system, it's a different world. And the success that you get in that world is going to look different than what you get here. And I think thinking about time, process, and systems is very important when you work with Indian law firms. So when you're looking to close a deal in 30 days, for example, and they tell you there's a competition law approval, I would ask Pallavi, how long will that take? Because it's going to be very different in India than it is in the US. I think the other thing that has been very interesting in working through it is also working with Indian clients in the US. I was just working on a acquisition for a public public company unicorn in India, who was acquiring a company in the US. And the pace was completely different. They worked faster, they worked in a way that was much more nimble, and they worked in a way which was much more business-oriented in a lot of ways. And I think that doesn't come, I think from the earlier panel, there was a little bit of talk about the business orientation. India right now is extremely business-oriented. It always has been, but I've never seen this kind of energy, I've never seen this kind of investment, and I've never seen this kind of risk-taking. So what you're seeing is an economy that is ready to really take its place in where it stands in the world. And what you're seeing because of that is the engagement levels have really gone, ratcheted up. And as partners to them, you have to keep up. And I think you have to keep up with the businesses, and you have to keep up with the law firms. I think the other thing I will mention is just in terms of working with law firms is it's important to meet in person. It really is. I think India is a world where Zoom has its utility, and but at the same time I try and visit at least once a year. I know my colleagues come here once a year. Many people visit back and forth. And that just breaking bread together is part of the culture. It's part of building the trust. And you really need to learn and meet with clients on both ends. So I think it's important to go and meet not just with people who are your clients today, who may be your clients, just to sit down, understand where the economy is going, understand what is happening in the whole commonplace, and just really understand the world in which we live. I'll mention one other difference when working with Indian law firms. India's litigation system is completely different than ours. There is no discovery. There are no depositions. And people in this room understand how much happiness that gives some of the companies. But that's a huge thing. And also you don't have to produce all documents, right? It's a very different kind of system. But also India has a criminal overlay to it, which makes things tricky. So what I always say when working with Indian law firms, know the expert, seek out the expert, make sure you have people involved that you trust 100%, people who will not charge you time for lying flat on the bed when they're charged coming across the ocean, and people that you know your clients in a way that you can be authentic with them. But you have to put in the time to learn the clients, learn the economy, and put yourself out there in that world.
Thank you, Pallavi. Now I'm turned to the other Pallavi. How is it from the Indian perspective of Indian firms working with American firms? And what do you see as some of the challenges or benefits in doing that?
I think a lot of our clients and the Indian law firms' clients do business in America one way or the other because America is a very large trading partner for India. Most of the foreign direct investment comes from the United States. So doing business with America is inevitable. And I think from our point of view, from our side, we put partners who either come back after working from the US and are familiar with how the US system works, how deals are done, because they've worked, say, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years over here. So I think the first point is that they are familiar with the system here. They sort of fit into that system and can negotiate at the same level for our clients when negotiating if there's an American lawyer on the other side. It also becomes important for us to work with an American law firm. And again, it's the relationships which are very important and critical. Can you pick up the phone and talk to the partner on the other side and say, look, client's not happy with this. This is what they're looking at. Maybe that's not on your radar. They're not able to communicate one way or the other. So I think relationships become very important. And there's no substitute for having done work together, sitting on the same table and talking to each other, meeting each other. I think those were the 3 or 4 important things. So equally, when an American firm looks at India, though maybe I come out to meet people here, but it's equally important for my partners to come out and meet people. That person-to-person connect is very important. And even if, say, Pallavi were to refer a matter to me, immediately I will bring on the correct partner and get on a call with her, give her the comfort that, this is the partner who's going to work, because ultimately she's going to have to be comfortable with the partner. So I think that communication, the most important thing is communication between the 2 lawyers, the 2 law firms, because unless you communicate constantly, I think the relationships are not built. Relationships are not built just matter to matter. So I think constant communication, meeting each other, understanding each other. And I think what Pallavi said is so important. India is a whole nation in itself. It's not just one country. It's a number of countries. Each state is different. Each culture of doing business is different. From a more, I would put it typically, from a more aggressive culture in the north of India to a slightly more conservative culture in the south of India. The West is very entrepreneurial. The Gujaratis and the Marwadis are very, very entrepreneurial. So there are different cultures. So when you do business, I think it's equally important to know the cultural aspects of doing business in India. And I think that's one of the most critical things, because when I as a lawyer would sit across, either for my client or for an American client, the first thing at least I need to explain to the American client is the culture, what to expect. Is it a promoter-driven? Is it a young startup? The aspirations of the 2 are very different. So understanding them, understanding the nuances of Indian industry is very, very important.
Thank you, Pallavi. I think it ties in very nicely with a question we heard in the earlier panel about how do you bridge cultural competence, right? As in any relationship, as both Pallavi's talked about, it's important to understand who the other person is and the systems, the laws, the different way that people do business or legal work in that culture. But maybe you could speak to what you bring in terms of cultural competence to help bridge those gaps and help your clients navigate a different culture, because there are some people here who are of not South Asian descent that need to figure that out. And more importantly, that's going to help you with other cultures as well. So maybe you can speak a little bit about that.
So I'll go first and then. So I think understanding your client and understanding the opposite side in a deal is very important. Is it the company that you are targeting or you're doing business with? Is it a promoter-driven companies? And India has predominantly promoter-driven companies, but they're professionally managed. There's some promoter-owned companies that are promoter-managed, some that are professionally managed. You also have the young startup. And as I said, the approach to each of these are going to be very different. Where a promoter is going to sell his shares or dilute, at the back of his mind, an older promoter is going to look at what's in it for me, because unless am I getting, non-compete payment somewhere, am I going to do this? Will my son who's coming into the business be protected? So these are some of the concerns that happen, and you have to appreciate and understand those. And maybe in a deal, you'll need to provide for some of these things. While you look at a young startup, the guy is raring to go. He has a good product, he has a good business, and he's happy to bring in those investors. He will come down to less than 10% if it's required. He will not think of governance first, but that's what the investors bring into the table. But they're raring to go and quite willing to shed equity without asking for too much in return. So I think those two perspectives are different. Secondly, when typically when an Indian promoter says yes, it doesn't necessarily mean yes till the deal is done and you've signed on the papers. Because as you go along, I've seen that issues that are settled can get reopened. So, and Pratibha can share to that. When she invests in Indian promoter companies, it keeps getting reopened. So it's never done. They've nodded, they've shook hands on this part of it. We've agreed, move on. 5 days later, they'll reopen, what they've already discussed. So these are some very, very typical. But even for the promoter, a relationship with the investor or a joint venture partner or an acquirer becomes very, very important, because when you're giving so much of equity away, you want to see that your company is in good hands at the end of the day.
Pallavi.
So, I'll add, I think one of the other things which is interesting also is culturally, you have to be a little bit attuned to the modes. I'll give you a simple example. I'm in the middle of doing a big investigation in India. And we have a client who's going through this big investigation. We were talking about it. Indians communicate through WhatsApp. We don't communicate through WhatsApp. So one of the ways that you do the investigation is realizing WhatsApp is on personal phones, making sure that discovery is taken in when you're doing your internal investigation by US firms and Indian firms together. It's a really simple, small thing. But if you don't do that, you've lost everything. All the evidence is gone, right? And I think that's part of what, when Ketu asked is, what do you do to make that bridge happen? The bridge doesn't always come from the obvious. It comes from the not obvious, right? I think one of the things that I know used to happen early in my career, people used to say, we'll get you a copy of the docket. And Indian dockets did not used to be open dockets. They used to be more closed dockets, and now they are much more open. And my question used to be, how are you going to get us a copy of the docket? And a lot of times they didn't want to tell you the answer, right? And that's the part that you have to bring value to your client and making sure they understand. My MNC client does not want to get the docket in that way, right? And I think that's one of the things that you have to play that role in being a pretty honest bridge, but also understanding what you don't know, right? So also understanding from being able to talk to your colleagues, being able to talk to your clients about, this investigation was a good example. The other thing I've seen in India is they're very team-based. They have a big team, and they will have 15 people on a call. And they're not because 15 people are not necessary. That is just how they work. They're a very team. And we are very much bullpen based, right? You'll have the partner, you'll have the associate, and you'll have another person, and they'll change. We change them out. That's how we operate. You have to respect that culture, because it's not about adding more bodies. It's about adding the expertise in ways that makes them more efficient for the client. And I think that's part of what we have to kind of keep doing for our clients, is reminding them of the reasons why things happen, not about finding flaws in those reasoning, but finding those bridges into that so that we are valuable to our clients in making sure, the investigation doesn't miss the WhatsApp messages.
Thank you. That's an excellent example of these cultural differences that exist. And I think Pallavi here brings a great bridge, because she has feet in both cultures. And that is something that is extremely valuable when you're talking about cross-cultural relationships and business or legal relationships. So, Prabhita, let me turn to you. What legal challenges do Indian businesses face when establishing offices and other business relationships with the U.S.? I know you're a lawyer by training, but also work in a private equity group and do a lot of business deals now. So maybe you could give us that perspective.
Thank you. And can I just at the outset, again, thanks, Seetal, for I would not have traveled 7 seas if I didn't know about your passion and your leadership and, being that SETU, the bridge between India and US, and it's so crucial. We do our businesses and we make those fees while lying down. But you do it for your passion and for your commitment. So thank you. This is a great initiative. I'm loving being here in Seattle. It's such a change for me because usually I'm in New York. I'm loving the energy and the diversity here in Seattle. So thank you, everybody, for the hospitality. But at the outset, again, I'm an Americophile. I studied both in UK and US, and once I came here, I was completely transformed in the way I think about business and how and the pace at which business should be done. I came here when India was still picking up on its liberalization and becoming more commercial. And it really changed my life. But I realize it's not necessarily true for everybody in India. We are traditionally more Europe-focused. Distance plays a huge role in it. India and US are just far. Trust me, this flight told me, again, reminded me just how far. But I was in New York for the American Bar Association meeting. And as an Indian, I was a minority suddenly. I mean, that usually doesn't happen. We are 1.4 billion people, But it was really, bunch of us representing, not, I would say handful of us representing Indian business there. And everybody else was, more this side of the world. And Latin America was a major chunk of it. And that really made me realize, even though there's been a bridging of the gap, it's still quite huge. It's cultural, it's distance, it's language, believe it or not. We speak English, but we speak English and you speak English, It's, what these lawyers do is translating that for the clients. And people don't necessarily appreciate it. They think, oh, it's an English-speaking country, we can go in and do business. But really, understanding that Indian standard time concept is just, there's small things, or, how you get documents from the courts. It's small things that are so unique, and person speaking in front of you might be saying in English, I'll get you the documents, but you don't want those documents the way they're going to get the documents. So the English is not helping because you're not understanding the cultural underpinnings. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of the physical, the cultural gap, and the legal gap. US becomes expensive for Indian businesses. The lawyers here are expensive. I'm not complaining. I was a beneficiary of it. But at the same time, when now that I'm hiring US lawyers, I rely heavily on the Indian lawyers to then, somehow reduce Pallavi's fees. But it's a reality, right? Because also you're very worried about US compared to Europe or Asia, where the society is not that litigious. Here, getting embroiled in a litigation is a real risk as a GC. So even signing an NDA, think twice. If they come with a US law non-disclosure agreement, which is very basic, I get worried. So that's a huge, it doesn't seem that big a deal, but when you are an Indian business investing in the US, it does become prohibitive. The India-US tax treaty, believe it or not, is there is a double tax avoidance treaty, but we are incorporated in Singapore. So as a fund, we are very US-India corridor focused, especially in our private equity fund. We do a lot of investments in the US, where the front end is in the US, and then they have back offices in India. So we do a lot of investments in US, but we are based in Singapore exactly because we cannot navigate the India-US tax treaty. So you go from India to Singapore and then from Singapore to US, which I think the governments need to kind of work out, because not, for a fund, it might work for us today, but there's a lot of focus on getting all the funds domiciled back into India. And one of the reasons that doesn't work for us is the tax treaty doesn't work that well. Then there's smaller things like CFIUS. You don't, as a lawyer, you might not think about it that much, but as an investor, every time I look at an investment, there's that extra cost and extra days spent on the CFIUS review, and it's subjective. It's not a very objective test. So at the end of the day, the lawyers will give me the analysis, and then I have to take the decision what to do with it, and it's not a pleasant decision to make. So, we have similar, not that wide a net law, but we have similar national security laws, and we've been constantly pushing on the government to make it more objective, and I hope the lawyers here are doing the same, because it's becoming a little painful for Indians. And lastly, since I'm sitting in a university, maximum students from India should be coming to US to study. The US education system, according to me, is much superior to anywhere in the world. But it is not true as of today. They are still going more to UK and Canada, believe it or not, because of, the cost is high, but also I think the cultural distance, the physical distance is more. So bridging that again, by such initiatives is going to help. And, those people then become people like sitting on and the previous panel who work here and increase the business between the two countries. So I think bridging that university gap for the US universities is also crucial. I'll stop there.
Anurag, from your perspective in advising clients, what do you see as some of the challenges and what issues your clients need to navigate when they're trying to enter either the Indian market or the US market?
Thank you. First of all, echoing everyone's thoughts, Sheetal and your team, this is such a wonderful thing that you have created here. I was talking to someone in North Carolina this morning bragging about you. Somehow or another, I took credit for it. But the energy, the space is fantastic. I'm going to come to a point I want to make about the state of Washington in a second. But to your question, so I've worked inside Indian companies for the last 8 years. And I used to advise Indian companies and US companies on bilateral market entry for many years before that. One of the things that's kind of central to all of this, and by the way, I appreciate everyone's remarks because there's so much insight here about what's happening in India right now. It's such a fascinating time. But one of the things that doesn't change in the US and in India, the catchphrase always is US-India relations, the world's oldest democracy and the largest democracy. What's missing there is not enough emphasis on democracy, right? So when I was global head of government and public affairs at Infosys, I focused on 7 different countries. They were all democracies, right? The approach to market entry and to growth and expansion is almost identical in all democracies, right? There's a voice of the people, right? So I had a client years ago, they were the US's largest pistachio grower. They wanted to export into India, but India had 33% tariff. Right, so they hired me to convince the Indian government to lower their tariff, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? Like, okay, I'll fly there and I'll tell them to lower their tariffs, right? Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? When Infosys came here, right, they had a reputation as just an outsourcing company, taking away American jobs, right? There was no there. What both companies were missing is that it's democracy. In India, right, Infosys is known in so many households, all universities, right? They're known as a charitable company. They're known as a productive partner of government. Like in India, Infosys is amazing, right? My client, the U.S. pistachio grower in California, right? Their CEO was on every gubernatorial board, right? He was the head of the California Agriculture Association, which is the largest ag association in America, right? But yet in India, he just went there and said, lower your tariff, right? Infosys wanted to be known for, but the thing is, these companies are forgetting it's a democracy over there just like it is here. And here you participate in the democracy. In India, Infosys participates in the democracy, right? That's the part that they forget to export. And it's really interesting. I guest lecture at Berkeley, and my class is called Beyond the Transaction, right? Because first of all, business is about the transaction. Like let's get that straight. There is no business unless you can do the transaction, right? But what the companies in the US and in India, and then I saw it also in the UK and Australia and Canada, right? Which is that companies coming into the market forget, right? Their whole self, right? And that's a piece of it. So this, the Modi Make in India strategy is not new, right? So when I was working on these pistachio tariffs, this was in the prior government. This is 2007, 8, 9, right? What I said is, look, what they want is for you to build a food processing center in rural India because they need more steady jobs in rural India because there are too many subsistence farmers. They said, oh, we can do that. I said, then we'll do it. Right? That's the thing. Walmart made that mistake. Walmart thought they could go in and just take over the market. Well, you have to remember, there's a lot of shop owners. There's a lot of shop owners that you have to, and you know what? The shop owners have a lobby. It's so funny. My in-laws, who are of Indian origin, when they heard I was a lobbyist, they said, "Oh, we know what you do." Right? I was like, "No, that's not what I do." Right? I don't, but there are lobbies, right? So one of the biggest hurdles is companies forgetting themselves and forgetting that where they're going. Indian companies coming here, U.S. companies going there, forget, right, their whole selves, right? As a related point, I just want to say, and I was making this comment to Sunny earlier, is that the state of Washington, by creating this center, right, and expanding this center, is creating a name for itself in the U.S.-India corridor. Right? But it doesn't need to be a US-India corridor. It can be a Washington-India corridor, right? And that is a relationship, right? My guess is, and you guys can correct me, that doesn't really exist in and of itself yet, right? But a center like this could be the centerpiece, right, of creating a Washington-India corridor when Minister X, Y, and Z, so I know your audience. When that minister comes to New York and DC, they know once a year they need to come here as well because Microsoft needs to see them. The agriculture, the orchard growers, they need to see them, and so on and so forth. So that is another piece that that both Indian companies who want to come to the U.S. and U.S. companies who want to go to India, there's a government pipeline as well to removing the barriers and obstacles. So I'll leave it at that.
Anurag, you make a very interesting point of like getting your clients to understand their whole selves and then taking that whole self to the other market that they want to enter. How do you help your clients see their whole selves? Like this idea of democracy, right? I don't think most businesses think about, oh, I participate in a democracy, but of course they do. How do you get the client to see themselves in their entirety?
Yeah, so
you need to pay him for that.
Yeah, well, actually, it's funny because I'm not an active lawyer anymore probably because I put too much practice into practice. So you don't have to pay me. But I will say that clients are. The practice of law was great if it weren't for clients, right? Like because they don't listen, right? But they don't listen, and sometimes you need a little help, right? And I won't go into specific examples because I might get into trouble, but there's companies that I've worked for who they kind of need to get into trouble first, right? And Walmart had that experience, McDonald's had that experience, right? Like a lot of companies going to India have had that experience, right? And, we can explain it as much as we want, right? But sometimes it needs to be the resistance is important. But I will say, one of the big mechanisms for getting Infosys to believe in it was literally the moment. The moment when the governor of Indiana put his arm around the president of Infosys in front of the media, right? Never had Infosys experienced that before, right? It's creating the moments, right? Creating the moments that have never happened before, right? And just realizing that a lot of Indian companies are making history with whatever they do here, and a lot of US companies in India are making history with what they're doing. That's how early we are in the relationship.
Pallavi Wahi, you have lived in multiple cultures and practiced and lived in different countries. How do you leverage those experiences to help your clients see their whole selves?
So first of all, my clients are not like his clients. Mine listen, and mine are the best, and they don't get into trouble. So none of my clients, including on this.
As you can hear, Pallavi is very persuasive.
Yes. So is Pallavi Shroff, right? So what I will say is this. I think as a lawyer, one of the things you have to remember is that a client makes a decision, you give advice. And as long as that decision is not illegal, you let them make the decision. And I think that's one of the things which, as a younger lawyer, I never used to really understand, because I used to feel like if I'm giving you a recommendation to do X, if you don't do X, you're not listening to me. That's not right. You are giving them a recommendation based on your reasoning of the law. They have to do what they need to do based on their reasoning of the business. There can be two different things. You also have to take into account risk allocations, and you have to take into account how clients think of it. That's actually very common cross-culturally. I would say, I think the difference is, as lawyers, that's a learning you have to get to with experience, that when a client rejects your recommendation, they don't reject your advice. They take it into consideration in making a business decision. And that's how I've always looked at it, is if I can take the recommendation and ground it in their business objectives, I make a better recommendation. And that has taken some time to get to a point that rejection does not come at the same time as someone not listening. So I think cross-culturally that goes across. I will say also, there are different hierarchical structures in play in the US as compared to India. I think that plays a role in how advice is sometimes received. I do think at the end of the day, what you have is a society as of today which is very open to listening to the expert. And I think as long as you're positioning yourself as the expert, or your partner or your associate as an expert, clients want to listen because they want to get to the best business decision. But you have to keep reminding yourself, and I'll say this to the students in the room, is we are not the smartest people in the room. We really are not. These clients are incredible. What they're doing in the business is incredible. What we are is mere partners in a journey they're on. And as long as we can play that role effectively, we will get them there. But if we start making it about our own ego, we will not be able to get there.
I think I agree with what Pallavi says, and that's been my experience as well, because you first have to understand the client's business, what's driving it, what's the client's philosophy of doing business, what is his risk appetite. Unless we understand all of that, providing practical solutions is not going to be possible. And that is universal. At the end of it, Sean, of everything that we do, it's understanding the risk appetite, allocation of risk, and mitigation of risk. This is the fundamental of any transaction that you do, or ultimately a dispute. Of course, you want to win the dispute, but this is what actually happens even as you keep calibrating your strategy in a dispute. And I think any business needs this constant communication, as Pallavi said. And I have seen that in India, when somebody like a Walmart comes into India, they will come with their government affairs department. And the largest deal that Walmart did in India was acquiring Flipkart. And I was fully involved in that deal. So I can say, and along with the corporate teams that were looking at different aspects of the deal, they were talking to me on how they were going to approach the market, what should they do, was their thinking correct. So this was not pure legal. And I'm not a lobbyist, or anyway, in India, the word lobbyist is actually very wrongly understood here. But, knowing the government, knowing how they think, what they do, is as much a part of the advice that you give to a client in a deal like Walmart acquiring Flipkart. It's an $11 billion deal. You cannot fall flat on such a deal. So I was constantly talking to their government affairs, and they must have been talking to 1 million people otherwise, as to how they should approach the government, what would be the selling point. So being in India, one would know what is bothering the government, what are the issues with the government, and it's simultaneously you're talking to them, and the deal is also getting structured. Input from one goes to the other. And I think this is part of the value addition that lawyers can bring, apart from just doing a deal. So today's expectation, as Pallavi said, is we are partners in their journey of the business, and we need to understand that. So while we do our legal structuring and legal documents, trying to make them as perfect, appreciating the journey, where in the journey they are, and what role. So it's also like a confidant. There we are a consigliere, we become a trusted advisor, and those are the roles that we also play, and that's the change that has been happening, I would say, over the last decade or so.
And Pratibha, from a more of a business perspective, when you are hearing legal advice and you're analyzing what to do and how to enter a market or make an investment, what sort of factors are you thinking about, or your clients thinking about, when getting that legal advice?
Depends on the jurisdiction, but I mean, central to it is, my job as being a GC is making sure that whatever advice these two are giving, my business guys are listening to. That's like the primary role. Like, they know what they're talking about, listen. But finding the right advisors, no matter...
How do you balance that out when you have that legal advice competing with your business folks, and balancing those two interests out?
The business sometimes gets very short-sighted, because the team wants to do the deal and wants to do it now, and or wants to do the exit and wants to do the exit now and take their caddy home and be done. I have to hold the baby much longer. It's a reputational issue which over encompasses any of the deals that they're doing. So actually, at my firm, if I say no, it means no. And that is the key. So the business guys might want their short-term profit and move on, and a lot of times I will put my foot down. And that's why it's very crucial as a GC that you do the legal hiring, so that the lawyers are coming and telling you what needs to be done, rather than business guys who are not necessarily listening. So sometimes, what both Pallavis were talking about was how, you have to think about what the business wants and accordingly advise. I tell my lawyers the opposite. I'm like, don't think too much about them. Think more about the organization as a whole and what risks I should or should not be taking. This morning I was doing a transaction where the lawyers were saying one thing and the business guys were getting frustrated, and both sides called, and I just had to tell my business guys, just listen. It's okay, it'll take 5 days extra maybe, but let's do it right. So in any jurisdiction you go, I think very crucial. The other mistake I recently made was, we were doing a co-investment with another fund, and the fund decided on the US lawyers, and I decided on the India lawyers for the transaction. It was a cross-border India-US deal. And the two did not work together well. And it was a disaster. Like, I spent more time on that deal than I ever should have, just because the advisors didn't work together. So that personal connect, like, if it was Sam, Shahadullah Marchand, and, Pallavi working together, it would have been much simpler and much quicker and much cheaper for me. So advisors become...
That's a lesson.
It is a lesson. But it wasn't Pallavi on the other side. And then, of course, the advisors include the bankers. And then the cultural aspect of it, again, we do a lot of deals in Southeast Asia too, which has its own culture. Every country has its own culture. So, finding that out for me and knowing what the legal risks are. I think for US, like I said, as far as possible, the reason we avoid US law documents is because it's a very litigious society. But getting that transaction done is so much easier in the US with US lawyers who understand India and Indian businesses. So I don't think there's enough emphasis that business guys understand on how important the advisors are.
Thank you. It turns to another topic that we have seen a trend in the legal world is the increased use of arbitration. For those of you that are not lawyers, typically people get in disputes, transactions fall apart. Where do they go? They come to the court. And we listen to both sides and we make a decision, or a jury makes a decision. Increasingly, many companies and businesses have decided, because of the cost of litigation being so high, they turn to arbitration, which is an alternative way to resolve their dispute, and the costs are less, and there are some advantages and disadvantages of arbitration. So, Pallavi Shroff, I'll turn to you. With this increase of litigation and cost of legal services, does arbitration present some good alternatives or some negative alternatives for Indian businesses in India?
I think given the backlog in our judicial system, and we have some way to go before we can fully tackle that. Efforts are on, but it's going to take a bit of time. Given that, I think for commercial disputes, having cost-efficient and faster disposal is the key. Arbitration, therefore, becomes very important and very necessary, the first thing. Because at least now, if you look at the Indian law and after its amendments in 16, 18, 19, 2019, there is time period fixed for everything. So we are supposed to finish our domestic arbitrations within a period of 12 months or 18 months. If you don't, you can go to court. Court will dispose of the application. And typically, they do not grant open-ended extensions. So if the judge is writing, the arbitrator is writing an award, then it will be 3 months or something like that. Otherwise, another 6 months. So there is a lot of pressure to complete arbitrations on time. Any challenge that happens back in court, and Indian courts are known to interfere, but now even if it's happening, I think the approach of courts is changing. They're very reluctant to sort of second guess an arbitrator's award, and any such application has to be disposed of within a certain time frame. Enforcement is a little easier. Enforcement is a challenge because the property or the land or whatever money you have could have been mortgaged. There's the lien over the property if business is doing well. Then there's going to be, enforcement does become a bit of a challenge because property, land, money is not free for you to go and this thing. So we've now seen a trend where you can go after the assets of a company or a promoter, those that are free of any lien or mortgage or anything. The Daiichi case against Ranbaxy has been one such example, why they've actually tried to trace where the money has gone and tried to undo transactions. Not a very happy situation for those who acquired the properties and the land and all of that, but that is a trend, just as we saw how when Government of India lost some of these BIT arbitrations, they went after the assets of the Government of India. Well, I don't know if that's going to be something that's going to continue in the future, but something similar we are starting to see even in India. So there is a lot more aggression on the enforcement side as well. The second big issue is confidentiality. People actually in business want that confidentiality. They don't want everything to be out in the public. So their competitors keep a very close watch on even the disputes that they are doing. What are the issues? Because quite often, court litigation can be part of a corporate strategy to buy some time against the competitor. I've got 6 months more. I've got another year with an injunction sitting. By the time I get a hearing, get a judgment, I've bought enough time for the market. So it can be part of it, So given some of these factors, arbitration is still the preferred choice because of the confidentiality, and grounds of challenge are limited.
And you mentioned backlog, just as a comparison point. You mentioned arbitration, 12 to 18 months or so. As a comparison, a court case, what is the comparison?
Court cases, the backlog, the last I was checking, the backlog was something like 5 crore cases across, including Supreme Court has about 69,000 cases.
So what does that translate to time?
Time. Supreme Court could take about 3.5 years to complete. The courts could well take over 10 years.
So 12 to 18 months or 10 years, yes. So
There's
quite
no
a difference in incentive.
Absolutely.
Now, Pallavi, here on the U.S. side, how is it that firms and also your clients view arbitration and the use of that tool?
So I think from the U.S. perspective, arbitrations are very helpful. They're effective. I think confidentiality comes into play for folks. I think it also makes it simpler sometimes. Also contains costs, for folks, even when you have a really well-run judicial system with our Superior Court judge, presiding judge in waiting here. But I do think, just thinking about the U.S. clients working with India, the advice that Pallavi gave is very consistent with what we get from a lot of Indian law firm partners. I think the issue that comes up for us is when a client gets embroiled in a criminal proceeding, where suddenly there's a criminal overlay coming into play, which kind of takes it out of the context of the arbitration, and that becomes really dangerous for the client, right? And it could come up in all kinds of contexts, but I will say right now what we are seeing is an increasing trend of the use of SAIC, which is the arbitration center in Singapore, where we have a lot of arbitrations happening, along with London as a seat of arbitration. Most clients want to have arbitration in their agreements. The place that the fight happens is the choice of law. What will happen is the clients will want, especially if it's a cross-border deal, the US client usually wants a US law, the Indian client wants Indian law. So you have, that back and forth happening. We also have a lot of back and forth happening as to the seat of the arbitration. Singapore is getting more accepted, especially because of the cost perspectives, right, as compared to some other jurisdictions. But again, I think a lot of this comes down to working with the Indian law firm partners are very great at giving us the advice on what we have to put into the agreement based on the circumstances of the client. Someone who's a very small client with a very small JV, what is really going to happen, right? And they may be okay with giving up the law jurisdiction, but most times the advice we get is consistent, is go with the arbitration clause. You don't want to be stuck in court for 10 to 12 years, and you have no effective remedy if there is a breach, and the other side will know it.
And when you mention criminal overlay, maybe you could explain to the audience what that means.
So, I got a call once in the middle of the night from a client who got arrested at the airport. And they got arrested at the airport for things I will not say, but there was anything other than the fact that the person was put in jail. And I think I called her, but I said, there's someone in jail. And she was like, who is it? Where is it? Tell me now. So I think it's one of those situations that things can happen any given moment in a system where the systems are not very clear. So over here, if you have that kind of situation happen, you know where to go at the bail, you know which system the person is. So I think that overlay comes into place. And I will let Pallavi answer this because she's obviously the expert. But what we see is if you suddenly have, for example, now I think there are new laws coming out saying that if you have a certain kind of investigation, you now have a requirement to report certain parts of that investigation to criminal authorities. So there's a lot of rules being set up in India which put in the criminal overlay into it, which we have to really rely on our Indian law partners to really guide us on to make sure our clients can steer well out.
And I'll turn to you, Pallavi, in just a moment. I think just as a big picture idea, when we think of civil disputes here, maybe a contract breach or a bankruptcy or something like that, that is completely in the civil world, in India, that can quickly turn into a criminal issue. And so there is a interplay between civil breaches of contract and bankruptcy and criminal consequences. And so, Pallavi, maybe you could address
I think the
it.
criminal overlay, which Pallavi mentions, is very important to understand. There are a couple of ways in which sometimes we've seen of late that even if it's a simple contractual breach, somebody makes it into a criminal breach, by saying we entrusted you with something, and the punishment for that is 7 years. Which means getting bail is very difficult. If your punishment is over a certain number of years, bail becomes a problem. Second, and way it's looked at, if you've done a structured transactions, and a lot of transactions when you do in India get structured because of the foreign currency laws that we have, and for tax reasons, all cross-border transactions are tax-driven equally. And we'll suddenly have the tax authorities come and say, but this is tax avoidance. Once the tax authorities are looking at something, you have the enforcement directorate who actually looks at seeing compliance of the foreign exchange laws. They come in right behind them, and those guys you don't want around. Because to the extent they're just breach of the foreign exchange laws, that's civil proceedings. Still okay, you can deal with them. But when they allege money laundering and under the AML laws, that becomes a huge problem because they have powers of arrest, they have powers of detention, they will keep you in that office all day, all night, and sometimes for 2 nights and 3 nights. They come and raid in your homes and stay there for 4 days and 5 days. So those guys are the ones you want to avoid, but they come in very fast. Anything structured, they will say, this is deliberate, you're doing a wrong thing, that's something, it's not a breach of contract, but it's doing something illegally. And the definition can be pretty wide. So those are the guys who knock 5 o'clock in the morning, then they say you're under arrest, or you called on a Friday morning for questioning, and they make you sit till about 5 in the evening doing nothing. They start at 5 in the evening, and then at 9:30, 10, they give you an arrest memo. Suddenly you want bail next morning. Those are the times when we are running around trying to...
And it's an interesting point. This is the cultural and legal differences that you need to understand as you're trying to navigate these different systems.
That's right.
So, Anurag, let me turn to you. What opportunities and challenges do you see in future business and political relationships with India and the U.S.?
I'll stay with opportunities. I mean, for Indian companies in the U.S., and I take your point about distance, right? It seems like there's such an inclination towards Southeast Asia, Europe, right? That a lot of Indian companies aren't kind of making the plunge here, and there's almost unlimited opportunities here for Indian companies. I say this thing: if you put a gun to an Indian CEO's head and told her that name 15 U.S. companies in India or you're dead, right? She will name 15 U.S. companies in India like that. You put a gun to a U.S. CEO's head and say, name 15 Indian companies in the U.S., that CEO's dead, right? That's that's the part that's really difficult to understand when you see what's happening in India. I've been in India 3 times in the last 3 months. There's a vibrancy, there's a business forward, there's innovation, there's so much happening right now in India, right? And I said earlier, my earlier comment was exporting their whole selves. I mean, they're just not exporting themselves, right? There's a lot that the Indian companies are not doing. There's a lot of opportunity for American companies. So the partnership has only grown, US-India, to $250 billion, only. Right? I mean, the Chinese partnership, U.S.-China, is triple and heading towards quadruple of that. There's so much opportunity if the U.S. companies let go of their ego a little bit and say, you know what? I'm going to give you the steering wheel, right? I'm going to bring my company, I'm going to bring what I'm good at, and then you drive, right? There's so much opportunity because the Indian corporates have the drive, but they also know how to drive, right? And by the way, has anyone here has driven in India? But there's so much if the U.S. companies let go of some ego and have a little bit more trust, right? And this is where the cultural differences today, 2023, are right now. American companies do not quite understand how amazing a lot of the Indian business community is at business, right? And I think it's just a little bit of letting go. And the Indian companies just have to come here, right? And I think that what one of the things that an institute like this does, it gives more exposure, right? Because again, as India is a whole bunch of nations in one, so is the U.S., right? And so it's this idea of you don't need to say, oh my God, New York's too big, right? Oh, I don't understand the politics of Washington, D.C., right? No, just come here, right? And I think that is a much more manageable bite, right? And I think that's kind of where the future, and I was mentioning to someone earlier today, is that's why a partnership with the business organizations, the local business organizations here, is really important, because they make it a manageable bite for the Indian SME, right? And honestly, even the big companies, right? And so that's, and I'll just go back one last thing with Infosys. When we were figuring out what to do and how to do America properly, right? We found so much comfort in going to Indiana, going to Hartford, going to Raleigh, North Carolina. So much more comfort because, all right, we can do this, right?
Taking a smaller bite, and that was manageable. All right, I want to turn it to the audience here. If you have some questions, we'd be happy to take a question or two before we go to lunch. Yes, let's start over here. Do we have a microphone? We do.
In India, how far can a CA, a chartered accountant, take a company in establishing and making, organizing itself within India? Or is it something you have to grab a lawyer with in the beginning?
Actually, the CAs pretty much can. The smaller companies, CAs actually will handhold you through it, much cheaper than Pallavi doing it. But I would always advise to go with a lawyer too. But sometimes it's a cost issue.
I think the chartered accountants typically will set up the company for any foreigner who wants, any business who wants to set up, they do the first hand-holding for a long time. And I think we've seen that initially a lot of the chartered accountants were actually doing the legal work and negotiating documents and transactions on behalf of the companies, while the American companies came with their in-house lawyers who were partners in law firms and other things, and Indian companies got a raw deal. Because again, as she said, it's much cheaper, the guy knows the business, he has the trust of the promoter, but that doesn't always help.
I think, yes, sir, and then we'll go there.
Up to a point, certainly helps.
Yes, sir. Right here, in the front here, or near the front.
As all of you as responsible community leaders and attorneys and legal experts, I always wondered in your communications with your clients, particularly large clients with investments and money, etc., how do you diplomatically inform your clients that they have also social responsibility and environmental responsibility? Because eventually anything happens, any judgment has impacts on society as a whole.
The good thing about India, which we really did not like in the beginning, but now I'm starting to love, is we have a compulsory corporate social responsibility surcharge of 2% over a certain amount of profits if a company is making. So traditionally, the Indian companies, and I've always loved this about America, I'll say it openly, the culture of giving is much stronger here. Kudos, Sunny, to, this is the kind of example which we didn't see that much in India. But now that it's compulsory, it's made our job of, telling people to do it much easier. Second, as more investment coming into India is through financial investors, private equity funds like ours are required by our investors to ensure that the portfolio companies follow what is ESG. So all our portfolio companies are required to be ESG compliant, which is environment, social, and governance compliance policies. So that's filtering into the startup ecosystem very strongly, because maximum amount of money coming is more financial rather than strategic. So that's also helping fill the gap.
And even for listed companies, it's now mandatory. The Securities and Exchange Board of India, through rules, has made it mandatory for every listed company to publish. It's above a certain size, but it's to publish a report on the sustainability report or the ESG report. The angle is more sustainability now, and so most companies actually have to show that they're taking steps to do it. Of course, you have the environmental laws and you get hauled up for not complying, show cause notices come, the litigation keeps going on. But I think seeing climate change around us, a lot of the companies are becoming conscious, but not all of them. Some of them will do it because they're mandated to do it, But there are quite a few responsible companies equally. Giving back to society is big. Philanthropy among the certain class of people is very important as well. And not many people will talk, but a lot of them do philanthropy or support non-governmental organizations in their own way. So we have a lot of our promoters who believe now in philanthropy.
What I've found in the U.S., the Indian companies I've worked with, they've found a way to marry what's good for business, what's good for the community, what's good for the environment, what's good for for philanthropy. So Infosys is another good example. They developed a nonprofit that focused on public school K through 12 education and skilling, and they focused on computational thinking, later on coding. And what they did is they funded and worked with public school teachers in rural and underserved areas. But what do they do for a business? They do their brain power by the hour. They do coding, right? I mean, so it all, and they wrapped it into lifelong learning, and that just became a theme, right? And their customers liked it. Right? And then they would do lifelong learning projects in the areas where their customers were. So again, it wasn't a mandate, but it just kind of made a lot of sense for them. So that's what that is.
One thing I'll mention is I'm the chair of the Seattle Chamber, and Eduardo and Brian is here. I think a number of us are on that board together. And one of the things, we've got about 50, 60 board members representing big and small corporations across the state, nonprofits, corporations. And one of the things that's really clear about the Washington community is that we do business with the patina of equity. Business itself has a conscience in the way that we have in Washington state, which is strong, and it shows itself in a number of programs, it shows itself in a number of things we have to do, but also shows in the things that we do. So I think as the chamber board, that's been very front of mind for us, and we've been thinking about that together. And I think that collectively has led to a sense of community in Washington state, where businesses are working together to make change happen, above and beyond our own individual interests in making it happen.
We have
a lot of corporates have accepted their responsibility to society. So apart from just CSR, I know the Bharti Group, for example, which is in telecom, the largest telecom company, actually runs schools across Punjab. Privates, they've taken over the public schools, they've transformed them, and they're actually running those schools. Several other organizations do the same thing.
I think there has been a change, and that's an excellent question, because that question reminds everybody that these are the questions we need to be thinking about,
Right,
and the issues we need to do. Another question here, maybe the last one.
Hi, my name is SETU Dolma, and I'm a second-year student at the law school here. So a lot of us here were born and raised in South Asia, and so my question is around when you're working, living, studying in settings that are heavily dominated by a culture that you didn't necessarily grow up in, what are tips you have from earlier in your career, and what opportunities, what advice do you have that we could, so that we can be in a position like where you are, where, having your feet in two different worlds, how do you get to that? What advice you have for students here who are negotiating these different identities?
I guess I'll take that one. What I'll say is, it's interesting, the last panel, Brian asked the question, what's your most favorite Indian restaurant? It's a very legitimate question. I used to hate that question. Whenever anyone used to ask me that when I was a young lawyer here, I used to say, why are you asking me? Ask somebody else, right? And what I started realizing over time was that is the best question to ask, because someone's trying to connect with me. But that authenticity of being myself took me some time to get there, because number one, I knew what my favorite Indian restaurant was, but I wanted to be just like everyone else. I wanted to fit in, right? I wanted to belong in the system, as opposed to being this outlier that had to make a face for myself in the system. Over time, what I understood was I don't have to have a different accent. I've never lost my accent. I've been here for 25 years. People come here for 25 days and they get an accent. I still have an accent, right? Never lost it. I've never tried, and as I got more senior, I got more confident in being able to be authentic and being able to embrace my Indian identity, and be who I am. K2 did my immigration paperwork to be a US citizen. That's how long we've all known each other and how we've all grown up together here. But that took time and confidence. I think coupled with that was the understanding that this society is an incredible society. I don't think there's many people who look like myself that are chairing and helming a major international law firm in the world, right? You could look around the world and look like, and that is the society that we live in. And I had to trust what this society, how I could fit in it and succeed in it for me to be able to go to my biggest achievement. But to do that, there was both trust and confidence, but also an understanding that I didn't have to change who I am to become that person. I could just be who I was and get there. It's tougher with my son. You know, my son's 9. And he says to me, you know, we'll go to the airport, he'll tell people they're from India and they became US citizens. I'm American, but I'm of Indian origin, right? And those are two very accurate statements, right? And it's tougher to bridge the culture gap there and make sure that he both respects and values his, you know, so yesterday, you know, we had thought maybe Kapil Dev comes. He had a cricket ball. He was roaming around with a cricket ball. But we had someone there, you know, we had a little event last night, and you know, there was Ajit George was there, who is the head of, you know, many of you've seen that Netflix film, Daughters of Destiny, which is about the schools that, you know, going to what Pallavi's talking about, the philanthropy happening in India. But really remembering where we come from to become who we are, but never being able to not limit ourselves from who we are going to become by forgetting who we were. It's a really long distance.
Before we turn to the last question, I'll just address as well the same issue. We have navigated these spaces. It's taking a lot of negotiations, a lot of setbacks, and then perseverance, getting up off the floor and moving forward. And I think one of the ways you do that is, again, as Pallavi says, know yourself, getting the confidence, but also surrounding yourself with people who support you, who are your champions. You know, I am the first South Asian judge in Washington, and that was 10 years ago. Now there are 3 others, and so there's 4 of us now. But my road was not an easy one to be the first. I stumbled. I went in an election. I lost. And, you know, you have to pick yourself up. You have to keep going. And again, knowing your strength, knowing who you are, having that confidence, surrounding yourself with people who support you and help you through that process, I think is one of the best recipes for success in achieving your goals. So, Akshat. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, my colleague Tamina and I, we have a joint question. So I'm going to go with mine first. Both of us are immigration lawyers, and one of the things that we think about often is the ease now with which India is enabling non-resident Indians of Indian origin to come back to India through the overseas citizen of India, and there was PIO before that. But the fact that, you know, as an immigration lawyer, I've seen always trends of people coming to the United States, and that trend shifted with individuals who became naturalized citizens in this country, but then have opted to go back to India to participate in this dynamic atmosphere to help India get not just a place in the room, but a place at the table. So from your perspective, what do you see? Do you see that? Is that a facilitating factor? What's your impression on NRIs coming back to India?
I think it's a good move. We saw what we call the brain drain in the 60s and the 70s. Everybody who came out here educated and didn't want to come back. India didn't present the opportunities for growth at that point. Suddenly in the last 20 years, I would think, and a little more since we liberalized, and over the last little more than a decade, suddenly India has presented opportunities for growth, for development, and for doing work that was similar to the kind of work the people did here or anywhere else in the world. Plus, I have always believed that the rupee goes longer in India than a dollar goes around in the US. Plus, it's easier to live in India than to live anywhere in the Western world, to be honest. You know, you feel cared for. So people are coming back. Yeah, you feel, no, it's even if you don't get the other help, I think it's just much easier to live in India. I have traveled a lot around the world, and I think it's just simpler and easier to live in India. Opportunities is the only factor that brings people back. Are they going to be able to make some good money, provide well for themselves and their family? And is there enough of a challenge to keep them challenged all the time? People in academia and medical research still don't come back. There's opportunity to set up hospitals and make a lot of money, but those interested in research still don't come back. The business, the professional services are likely to come back, and they're still coming back.
Well, sorry, last question, I promise. Well, first of all, thank you so much to each of you. I mean, I sit here so proud that SU has organized this event, and each of you who are friends and colleagues have given us such an amazing dialogue. My question is actually to Anurag, perhaps. You said, as an immigration lawyer who's helping people come to the US, particularly Indian companies, you said that they are driving, but you need to have the whole body here, and immigration is a problem. So what are you seeing, and how do you deal with that with your clients?
So that's right. The movement of people is an issue for the United States. And where this is going to go, you know, first of all, you spent 10 years as an immigration lawyer as well. You know, where this is going to go is in a bad direction for the United States. I know I keep using Infosys as the example, but it is an example. So we needed more. We needed more coders, and we were hiring American graduates by the thousands, but Indians have the market, right? And so we knew if we had a team of 7, we needed 3 people. We just couldn't find them in the U.S., right? But we knew we could get them from India, right? But we couldn't get them here, right? About 3 years ago, Infosys, we opened a Canadian office, right? That we are now, I don't work there anymore, but Infosys is now the fastest growing company in Canada, all right? They went from about 350 people to they're hitting 9,000 next month, right? Within 3 years, right? And I mean, had the US policy corrected itself, and it won't. I work on this in Washington. It's not going to correct itself. And so what this means is that U.S. is going to lose the opportunity for that talent, and right, and they're already losing people who have realized that, you know what, I can study here and just go back to India, right? We're losing the opportunity to get the people who actually want to come, who are making the active decision that I want to go to the U.S. and build my life. Not getting them.
That's right. And if you went to the Infosys campus, as Anand was saying in the earliest session, it's as good as any other campus anywhere in the world. I can say I've been there, I've spent time there, so I can tell you it's as good as anything else. You go to the Satyam campaign, which is now Tech Mahindra, fabulous campaigns. And the whole centers are fabulous, absolutely. You don't feel you are in India sometimes, you know. So all of these guys have done so well.
So we are at the end of our time here. Please give a round to our panelists. And I'll turn it over to Sheetal for some announcements.
Thank you, Ketu, Pallavi, Anurag, and Pratibha, and a million thanks, actually, because this is how much it's costing us. No, I'm just kidding. This was an amazing panel. It's all pro bono, yes. I've learned so much. I teach these wonderful students. I have half the first year class, so 80 students in my contracts class, and I think that what you've told us is extrapolated to other areas of law. It's not just about India and US, it's universal. It's about cross-cultural competency and how to work effectively across as lawyers. And I'm going to take that knowledge and obviously share it with all of our students who would love to hear it. And again, thank you so much, appreciate it. Please stay tuned. It's lunchtime, so enjoy your lunch. You can go outside, upstairs, grab a box lunch, and be sure to come back here by 1:10 because we'll start with Congresswoman Jayapal at 1:15, and we're going to switch gears and talk about politics and really talk a little bit about human rights as well. So it should be both intriguing and exciting. Thank you.